Alice, and you are in Gothic Land, a place where we talk about all things Gothic and where I help you overcome all your fears, whether they are your fears in communication, whether you have fears of the unknown, whether you have fears about ghosts, about death, any kind of fear, I'm here to help you with, because the Gothic is actually the best fiction text, is the best mode that you can overcome a lot of the fears that you have in life. So today we're going to be talking about folklore. Yesterday we talked about the sublime. Today we're going to be talking about folklore in the Gothic and the importance that this has as an element that continues even nowadays, is still there, relevant for the productions that we have right now in our Gothic productions, in our modern Gothic production. So I hope that you had a think about yesterday's sublime and that you've been finding already some examples of where sublime is nowadays and how that has evolved since the first Greek documents about the sublime. And today, as I said, we're going to go into the Gothic, into the folklore and the influence of the folklore in the Gothic. And for that, I am going to be using a dissertation. This dissertation is called "The Function of Folklore in Selected English Gothic Novels," and it was written by Ronald Lee Reed in 1971. I think this is super important because this essay or this dissertation has got a lot of the elements that I find myself really interesting regarding folklore, and that I didn't really quite think when thinking about folklore in the Gothic or folklore in general. I never thought of those elements under those lines, and it's true, it's interesting, it's what we intuitively we all know. But following these dissertations, I said, we're going to find out a lot of interesting information that you're going to be able to use in when you're reading your Gothic text now, right now, in this time, okay? So going back to the idea of the sublime, we have that one of the elements that Edmund Burke talks about is the element of obscurity. And this element is actually the element that is mentioned in this dissertation, and is the element that actually contributes with making things as dark and terrible as possible. Thinking about it, why do we feel attracted to these books or these stories? It's because of this obscurity, these dark elements. We are scared, don't forget that. We are scared, but at the same time we are really attracted to these, right? We really want to know, we have curiosity, so we can stop reading even though we're super scared. We're so inquisitive and we're so curious that we need to know what's going to happen next. So this is the element that we have been what we've been talking about since the beginning, right? That this is an element, the obscurity, we don't just find it at the beginning of the Gothic. The obscurity element is again one of those things that has always been there, and this is something that in this dissertation Ronald talks about. So what happens, okay, going back to what happens in the 18th century, is that it's not that they have invented the dark elements. They were already there. What they did was to rediscover them. And what happened was that that scholars of the time, and this is, I'm quoting the dissertation, the scholars of the time recognized a source of powerful material by contemporary writers. So the only thing they did was to recuperate those elements that were already on place, they were already on the table, that had already been used by people, writers, poets like Shakespeare, and now we retake them back and we use them again. We give them a little bit of a shake. We recuperate some of the elements, but introducing new ideas to adapt them to the times, and voila, we still have Gothic nowadays because of these elements. Now you're going to see what those elements are. So one of the things is that we have to think that folklore plays a big role in our inherited imagination. So the fear created through the oral traditional stories, remember that folklore comes from the oral tradition and then it was written down on paper, the stories were written down, they take us to look back to medieval times. And these already had existing dark elements, right? So remember that the Gothic is all about going back in the past and thinking about the medieval times and setting the stories, the initial stories were set up in medieval contexts. So like castles, all ruins, and we have all these elements that are still, even nowadays, we are attracted to. So if we think going back to William Shakespeare, don't forget that he really made good use of supernatural elements such as ghosts, witches, curses, love and death, betrayal, inheritance, among other tropes. So if you think about those, you're going to see that, yes, they were already there before the Gothic. So elements that were inherited by the folklore, like incest and legends, such as the one of the Wandering Jew, were also elements that were recuperated later on by the 18th century writers. So what we find here, and this is what the dissertation talks about, is that with folklore, we are at the core of the supernatural. And even though there's much more to the Gothic than ghosts and the supernatural, mainly in times where science can give many logical explanations to certain events, we have that this is a very important and very heavy, still very important and relevant element in the Gothic, even nowadays. I know that the Gothic is not just about the supernatural. There are other elements that the Gothic, everything that is in the grey areas, that are things that we cannot explain, not because they are from another world or the afterlife, but because we can explain them, because they are strange, they make us feel uncomfortable. There might be things that are ideas in our heads. All these also falls in the Gothic. But since what I really like from the Gothic is this space or this area of the supernatural, what we cannot give explanations to or what we cannot see but we can sense, then I really like this part where we talk about the folklore. So then we have to also remember that when we go back to those elements and the folklore, you have to think that culturally, not every country, not every story in the world has got the same type of folklore. But what all the stories have in common worldwide is that in every society, in every culture, in every country, you have the belief of ghosts of a form or another. You have the belief of the supernatural. So these may look different in different cultures, in different countries, and in other places they are not called Gothic, but in England they received this label at this period of time that we're talking about, 1700 to our times, okay? So this strangeness is what is common to all cultures worldwide. This fear of the unknown, the traditions, the super strong, the weight of the traditions, that is really, really important when we define the Gothic. And it doesn't have to have that name. It can have other names, but it's super important you have that clear if you want to understand the use of all these elements. So some of the influences of folklore we see, for example, in the productions that came out of famous writers' retreat in Villa Diodati between Shelley, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, Claire Clairmont, who was this Mary Shelley's stepsister, Lord Byron and Polidori. What happened is that in that space, in that moment when they met, in a specific moment in time where we had this geographical moment with that, there was called the summer with no days. It was the longest summer. It was really dark. It was due to an eruption of a volcano, which nowadays it sounds like I'm talking about this, and there's something happening here in Spain as well with the islands, and we have a terrible news and terrible situations with the volcano. But this can cause anxieties, and it can cause people getting together and creating these monsters that are actually a product of the fears of the contemporaneous moments that we live in, extreme situations, really sad situations. So in a similar way, these writers met and they started reading German folklore or German folk tales that also have the name shower roman, and that are known in English as Phantasmagoriana. So that's how we got Frankenstein, the production of Frankenstein, and we got the vampire by, well, Lord Byron, but it was really Polidori who wrote that. So we have that the original German stories that contain gnomes, spirits, and diabolism were actually the source of inspiration for these writers that went into that retreat in a specific historical moment where there was a catastrophe, geographical catastrophe. So, what is the function of folklore then at this point? So, we see that at the early stages of Gothic stories, there was undoubtedly the necessity to talk about superstition. And superstition is a very important element when talking about folklore because it was believed by authors excuse me, from the medieval ancestors that had been ruled largely by them. Sorry. Excuse me. So this is very clear in the first Gothic period, right? So we have the medieval ancestors really truly believed in superstition, and there was something that was really strong, and it was at the core of the stories, of the dark stories, of scary stories. So this is very clear, for example, in the first Gothic period. And we see that with the Castle of Otranto, where we have this superstition that is really strong and a really intense feeling in the novel. So this actually created this desired scary atmosphere. So that's why it was a tool that it was necessary to use, because it created the atmosphere and the environment that we really need for a Gothic context. So that's why countries like in Spain made a good location and source of inspiration, because we had the Inquisition at the time that the Gothic started in England. Here in Spain, we were going under the influence of the Inquisition, and that meant that these elements that other countries saw, they took as a source of inspiration to write the Gothic novels. So we have the elements of the monks, we have nuns, we have incest, we have omens, we have ghosts, we have witchcraft, we have legends, we have works such as Faust, we have the power of dreams, we have the burial of the dead. All of these make a really good stock for this literature to proliferate. And this is super important. That's why folklore tends to maybe not to be mentioned initially, but is one of the characteristics, and is a heavy and is as important as the sublime. It makes up what the Gothic is as well. And the mixture of all the elements is what makes the Gothic so interesting. Another interesting point in this dissertation is to show, and it's what he says is the superstition regarding the misery of the soul and the unburied dead resulted in various practices pertaining to the treatment of the dead body, right? So this is super important as well, because if you are aware of this, the moral aspects around the person who died and the crimes they made during their life, this is a very Christian belief, but this is something that comes already from the Greek and the Roman societies. We had that that if you had been a certain type of person in life and you were not buried properly because of your actions during the life, or because of circumstances, and you were not buried properly, the burial was a very important event, and it's something that even nowadays we do in ways that help us come to terms with the death of the person, and we can grieve it, and we feel like we need to do this closure. But imagine that in this 18th and 19th century, when we have medicine starting to need bodies to investigate, they ended up using the bodies of criminals because it was believed that criminals didn't really go to heaven anyway. So you couldn't use a body that was supposed to be going to heaven, because you would destroy the body and you will stop the body from going, or the person, the soul of the person, well, not the body, but to destroy the soul of the person to go to heaven. But in case of criminals, then that wasn't the case, and they used many criminals for investigating the body, how the functioning of the body, and to move on medicine like that. But this has an origin already in what we inherited from Greek and Roman societies in the Western world. So the superstition, this is another quote from this dissertation, is that the superstition regarding the burial of the dead and the practices which derive from them make an important contribution to the Gothic novel. And this is something that I have not seen in many places. It's something that maybe goes amiss, and is super, super important, mainly when we're talking about the factor. We're talking about the death factor, we're talking about disappearance, we're talking about what happens to the soul. Is there a soul? What happens to the soul after dying, after your body has died? And this is an eternal topic, it's an eternal conversation, it's an eternal theme for creating stories around that. And because we still haven't got answers, we still have people with abilities to see the beyond, but we still haven't got answers that we can justify scientifically, and therefore we keep going around, and we need these texts to still find solutions and to find answers to our fears and our anxieties regarding death. This is something I talked about with Tuche when I interviewed her, and you can go and watch my video in YouTube, and it's called Interview with a Horror Investigator, Researcher. And we actually talked about how death and grief is used in films, in modern films, but also in other films, and how the history, the most recent history about grief, bereavement, and coming to terms with disappearance of a body, and how horror shows that in the films. So I think that's super, super interesting, and that again is something that horror recuperates very well. But again, there's a struggle showing the burial, the process of once we pass away, and what happens to our bodies, and then what do the family have to do about that, and what they end up doing. So another superstition, and with that I'm going to close today's event, is the apparition of the devil, and in its many varied ways and forms of apparition. That's again another theme that keeps appearing as part of the folklore, and again is so characteristic in the Gothic. And nowadays we have endless productions regarding the Satan. If you're watching Lucifer, we have like a really soft now, if you want, not at the beginning, but now in the last episodes, like a softer version of Lucifer, this fallen angel, that we can see more the human side. We now see like the humorous side. We see a lot of human traits in an angel, that supposedly angels not necessarily like humans, or although there are lots of stories about humans and angels mixing up as well. But the devil topic, or topic trope is everything. Is one of the eternal themes that we use in Gothic texts. If you think about Faust, and we think about the temptations of the humankind, if you think about Melmoth the Wanderer, the devil was there tempting Melmoth again. And this curse is recurrent as well. So again, this comes from our Christian tradition of heaven and hell, good versus evil, so typical in England and European countries as well. So in other cultures, we wouldn't be able to talk about good and evil in the same way. We will have to look at these Gothic elements from their own cultural points of view. But what have you learned from this, or what can we learn from this? And I want you to think about this for the next day, for tomorrow. What do we learn from this? Well, I want you to think of a moment. I want you to think of a time where you felt this anxiety of the tradition, of the superstition, and how it all mixes up. If that is something that you think about, if it's something that you look for when you're reading a book, what are these elements that actually appear in this kind of texts and that you feel like, yes, I enjoy it because it gives me an answer, or maybe you just enjoy it and you don't know why. I want you to think about that, and I want you to tell me in the comments below. And the same for the other videos. I will post all the links. Remember as well that if you want to have a private chat with me, you can go to gothicalice.com, and then you can book a time where I can see how I can help you with your fears. If it's in the communication space, or if it's in the Gothic arena, you would like to know more about it, how will you approach a text, if you're a writer, if there's anything I can do to help you because you've got at the moment some imposter syndrome, or because you would like some advice regarding certain aspects of the Gothic novel. So whatever that is, write to me. The first session is free. And you also, if you go to my website, you also have some free downloads that you can have a look at. I know that in the last week I was telling you about a specific free download, but you can just subscribe to my blog, or you can download things that you think are convenient and more suitable for your profile and what your needs at the moment. So since I don't think I do have questions right now, I'll just, no, at the moment there are no questions. So thank you for watching, and I hope that tomorrow you are here as well, and then we'll talk about the next part, which it'll be tomorrow. We're talking about the uncanny, so don't miss that because there's a lot to say, and it's gonna be super fun again. Right, so thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow, and take care. Bye bye, Gothic friends.